Welcome to our May webinar, a collaborative presentation of the Federation for Children with Special Needs and the Recruitment, Training and Support Center, RTSC. I am Jean Willoughby, Outreach and Recruitment Specialist with RTSC. In recognition of May's Mental Health Awareness Month, today's webinar is Mental Health and the IEP with Mary Beth Landy, the Recruitment, Training and Support Center Trainer and Recruiter. Mary Beth, welcome.
Thank you, Jean. It's great to be here. So today we're going to be talking about mental illness and the IEP. We're going to go over review some common diagnoses and the history behind them for children and adolescents. And I specify that because the diagnosis looks different for children than it does for adults. We're going to talk about community-based services that are available to families, the impact on accessing the curriculum, some related services for the IEP. We'll talk about least restrictive environment regarding placement, some discipline and manifestation of a disability, and how that impacts kids with emotional disabilities, and we will review goal writing. So where does one begin? This is a disability. We're talking about disabilities that people cannot see. It is unlike other disabilities in the fact that there are no clear definitive tests for this. Many times the symptoms of this are comorbid, or they are present in several different diagnoses, making it very difficult to diagnose a child. Many times this is misunderstood. It's thought of as behavioral or parenting issues as opposed to mental health issues. And many people think of that it is not requiring special education services, but in fact it does on emotional disability. And just a note of that, we are going to talk about the disorders, but you do not have to have an emotional disability in order to get an IEP for social and emotional issues. So just a little bit of background and some statistics. Mental health in Massachusetts. During the school year of 2017-2018, there were 291,139 students residing in Massachusetts. Of those students, 21.4% high school students and 13% of the 18 to 15-year-olds in the Commonwealth had a serious mental health condition. Suicide has now become the second largest causing death for young adults, 15 to 24. Previously was the third. And for that school year, 28.1% of high school students with a mental health disability dropped out of school. And these are Department of Education statistics. So mental health in children, the state regulations define emotional impairment as the inability to learn that cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors, or the inability to build and maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers, or the inability, inappropriate behaviors or feelings under normal circumstances, normal, questionable word, a general or pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, or a tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personal or school problems. So let's start with attention deficit hyperactive disorder. These are some characteristics that you may find with children with ADHD. Restless leg syndrome is something that usually was thought to be an adult disorder happening during sleep, but they expanded that syndrome to include children. Incessant talking is one of the considerations. Reckless behavior, and that looks different depending on the age of the child. It could be reckless behavior of experimenting with drugs as an older child, but for a younger child, it could be something as running out in the road without checking both ways. Poor organizational or executive functioning skills, that comes into poor time management as well. The inability to sit for a long time or inability to wait their turn. making careless mistakes because of the impulsivity of just getting done with things, forgetfulness, and angry outbursts. And we'll talk a little bit more about the outbursts in a minute. But by outbursts, I mean really not the average temper tantrum that every child throws, but more of what one might consider a meltdown. So generalized anxiety disorder. It has several different types of disorder underneath it. Separation anxiety, which is really normal for young children up to the age of preschool, early school age. It's the fear or loss of a significant person. So many times you'll see this with preschool kids when they get dropped off in the morning. They become very clingy with mom and they start to have a breakdown emotionally. Phobias or fears of specific events or things that are happening. One common one is fear of, say, spiders. It may not necessarily be something that's actually happened or caused by an event, but it's the perception of it. Social anxiety disorder, the fear of being in groups or public speaking. All children have to at some one point or another get up in front of the class and speak, and that can be anxiety provoking for anybody. But we're really talking about it to an extreme where children will avoid being out in recess because they don't want to be in a large group. And that makes them fear. Or having really panic attacks when having to do any sort of public speaking, even in a school environment. Panic disorders. So it's anxiety that causes a sense of dread or death, a sense of death, not death itself. There's strong physical reactions, very similar to the tightening of the chest, to having trouble breathing. Many people will describe it as feeling like they're having a heart attack, and therefore they think they're dying when in fact they are not. And a lot of, if your anxiety of the other types of anxiety becomes so great, it can turn into panic attacks. And that is something that is, if you've ever experienced one, it is quite a difficult reaction to try and process through. And there's generalized anxiety disorder, which is anxiety that can't be specified to one of the other disorders. So the manifestation of anxiety in children and adolescents, that constant thought or fear of safety of self or parents. I have seen this particularly with foster children who do not necessarily have contact with the biological family and wondering what if something's going to happen to my family and I don't know about it. So we can see this a lot with the population of students that we work with. Refusal to go to school. I know that there's probably at least one or two of you that have a student somewhere that refuses to go to school. It's usually anxiety that is the issue behind it, and that anxiety may be a manifestation of something that's happening at school. There may be bullying going on that has led to the development of this anxiety, but refusal to go to school refusal is usually a mental health issue and not a willfulness issue. Frequent physical complaints. As many of you know, that when children have anxiety in their systems, their hormones are increased. The hormone of cortisol, which gets increased, leads to additional acids in the child's stomach. So many times that leads to generalized stomach aches. It's not a specific, ooh, I hurt right here, but I kind of hurt all over. Extreme worries about things. If you have a constant worrier about the little things happening, a lot of times when children are younger, you'll see them be very clingy to a safe adult. Sometimes that is tied into socialized anxiety or separation anxiety, excuse me. The tantrums at time of separation, also when it's anxiety, are not just your regular tantrums that you can distract a child from and they'll be fine. These are tantrums that go on, or meltdowns, for a long period of time. And there's no self-soothing involved. Nothing seems to help the situation. A lot of times there's trouble sleeping. Sometimes that's due to the stress levels in their body, and it leads to nightmares. The fear plays itself out in the unconscious. And loss of interest in preferred activities. If you were to ask a child, what's your favorite meal, and they couldn't tell you, or what's your favorite event that you like to do, what do you like to play, what's your favorite class, if they couldn't answer any of those questions, a lot of times that is a symptom of anxiety. So overvigilant, the inability to be able to settle and to watch what's going on all the time. Overly sensitive to sounds in the environment. Kids that are always worrying about what was that, what happened, what's that noise. I know that this can happen even for kids that are older children, can definitely worry about being in the dark, and at nighttime what's happening when they hear a noise outside and it's just the wind with the tree hitting. They don't necessarily have the cognition to be able to think in those moments of anxiety about what is a logical explanation for what's happening. So their mind has a tendency to wander to other things, worrying about things before they happen. And sometimes that can be a pervasive situation. They're constantly worrying about what if. Repetitive thoughts and actions or obsessions. This sometimes appears in anxiety. It's not a common characteristic for children with, for older children for a lot of times. Low self-esteem. A lot of children, and particularly we see this with the children we work with in foster care, that they have self-esteem issues anyway, and it manifests itself in anxiety about what will people think of me, because they don't have the capacity to think highly of themselves, so therefore they're projecting what that emotion is with other people. And sometimes, rather than being overly active in their anxiety and acting out, many times people just shut down. I have definitely seen that, even with my own children, that who are usually very talkative, hyperactive, will shut down and become very quiet, or freeze, as we like to say. So let's take a look at depression. Children suffer depression from all these symptoms. They suffer depression. Depression looks different for a child than it does for adults, and that's really important. The depression for a child may not necessarily look like the desire to crawl under the sheets in pajamas and eat ice cream. A lot of times it places itself in increased irritability. They are angry and irritable about everything. Again, it comes back to that inability to self-soothe. Feeling sad and hopeless, they're not happy about anything. No matter what you do to try and help them out or see the positive side, they're unable to do that. They also have low self-esteem, and it's chicken and egg is whether the low self-esteem leads to depression or the depression leads to low self-esteem, but there's that is definitely a characteristic of it. Lack of energy, and they either sleep too much or have trouble falling asleep, and that can actually coexist. They could have trouble falling asleep, and then once they're asleep, they could sleep for 20 hours. So I know in our household, melatonin was God's gift. The loss of pleasure, this is similar to what I was talking about with anxiety. They don't have anything that they can say that they like or is fun to do. And depression can definitely lead to problems in school because they're not engaging because of a lot of different things that are going on with them. They may have lack of sleep and therefore some chronic fatigue issues going on. They don't have pleasure in what is a preferred activity at school, so the motivation factor goes down. Restlessness, they may find it hard to concentrate and pay attention because they're having repetitive thoughts and worries about other things. They can become more aggressive with friends and parents, and you'll see that with the irritability. Definitely can increase if pushed or if not handled appropriately, which can become either explosive or implosive or self-directed, which can lead for many students to self-harm. And not just as simple of cutting, but a lot of times that leads to eating disorders with young children, or I should say tweens, have usually when the eating disorders start. Have aches and pains for no reason. A lot of that reason comes back to what's physiologically going on in the body when mental health disorders come up. Those stress hormones that are happening are definitely affecting them. Change in eating habits. They may either start binge eating, hoarding of their food, or they lose their appetite and don't feel like eating anything, even some of their favorite foods. And suicidal thoughts and ideations is definitely true. And by that, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have an active plan, but you may hear things like, I wish I was never born, or I wish I would go to sleep and I wouldn't wake up. So those should be taken as seriously as a sign of depression as if someone said, I wish I would hurt, I could hurt myself, or something to that effect. Ideation is as important, and we should keep an eye out for that. So I wanted to look at bipolar disorder, and the reason being is this is a disorder that has two different states to it. There's a manic state and there's a depressive state. Children have a tendency to have both states, and it's called rapid cycling. For an adult may go through a period of manic state for a couple of weeks and then go into a very serious depression. Children can actually go through a manic state and rapid cycling multiple times in a day. So it's just like head spinning as how they're bouncing around and they can't control themselves 1 minute and starting a project and playing and taking everything out of the toy boxes. And then the next minute they are on the couch, crashed, sleeping. So it definitely, it kind of leads in from the anxiety, the depression, and the ADHD into bipolar. There are many times, bipolar is considered a serious disorder to diagnose, particularly for young children. So a lot of times you may see them being diagnosed with ADHD first, until their characteristics kind of work out. Is this a personality situation for the child, or is there something else going on? So it's not uncommon to see ADHD and bipolar on an IEP. It's questionable as to whether that ADHD is still happening at that point. So a couple of things about the manic state. It's a state of euphoria. You feel on top of the world. You can start a lot of projects. Doesn't mean they get finished, but you have a tendency to start a lot of projects, move on to things. A grandiose sense of the ability to be able to do anything. For kids that have really bad manic episodes, sometimes they're on the roof thinking they can fly. So it can be very dangerous, and delusions lead into that. They can go for periods of time and days without sleeping. They have a lot of loud speech and racing through their thoughts. A good lack of judgment, because their cognitive thinking processes have decreased at that point. Overly multitasking, starting many projects at the same time, and have a hard time focusing on one thing to try and finish it. And the depressive state, definitely a sense of lack of sense of self-worth, has no sense of hope. They feel like it can't be helped, the loss of interest. Because there's eating involved with it, they can lose or gain weight, sleep more than usual, and have trouble concentrating. So I wanted to compare a little bit about bipolar to ADHD. There are some similarities, which is why it can be misdiagnosed many times. The impulsiveness, the inattentiveness, the hyperactivity, physical energy, and behavioral and emotional issues that come up. But there are some different differences between the two of them. And that's when taking a good history and possibly good neuropsych would help. The bipolar, for example, destruction is out of anger. There's an intent to do it, where ADHD, most of the destruction has a tendency to be out of carelessness. They don't have a good sense of their body self, so they have a tendency to do things without necessarily thinking about the consequences of it. For outbursts, the intensity of the outbursts for bipolar can be much higher than that for ADHD. Bipolar, I've heard of outbursts that happen for up to 4 hours. And one of the other things that happens is the child is filled with stress hormones, so their energy level and their muscular abilities are much stronger. I have seen a 3-year-old throw a recliner across the room, but they can go on with this level of intensity for 4 or 6 hours, and then they just crash afterwards. They fall asleep, and when they wake up, they don't remember what they did. So many times kids have destroyed their rooms and then not understood what happened afterwards. So that's due to loss of memory of the outburst. Authority figures and hearing no is, no child likes to hear no, but it's definitely a huge trigger for a child who has bipolar. The difficulty falling asleep, slow to arouse in the morning, and kids with ADHD, if they've gotten a good night's sleep, can have a tendency to be very boingy, vivacious in the morning. Kids with bipolar can have what's called night terrors. There's a couple other disorders that have them too. It's different than a nightmare, and they have a tendency to be very gory in detail and very real to them. The ADHD, the learning is compromised by coexisting, is often compromised by coexisting learning disabilities, where learning is compromised by motivational deficits for a child with bipolar. And some other differences. Bipolar kids sometimes are very hard to do a neuropsych or psychological testing on because they're intolerant of the interview process. They are very smart and know what's going on. Danger seeking, they're looking to be able to arouse people. I know with a lot of kids, they get a giggle that is beyond funny, and it's kind of an indicator that they're stepping a bit too far. And a hypersexualized behavior can happen very early on for as early as preschool. It's harder to contain them as they get older, and they exhibit gross distortions about perceived reality, or being able to explain and discuss emotional events because they don't necessarily have that tolerance to go through that process. It is commonly confused and misdiagnosed. So I want to talk about trauma and stress-related disorders briefly, because that is a whole separate training that we can go into. But there's post-traumatic stress disorder, and PTSD can occur even in young children. This is from the DSM-5. There's reactive attachment disorder, and it's when the child has an inability to attach to parent figures or authority figures, what I will call appropriate attachments, and have a tendency to cling to inappropriate attachments. They'll want to call the bus driver mom as opposed to with their own mom. And there's also developmental childhood trauma. I will put in a little plug here. We are doing a developmental childhood trauma training coming up at the end of the month. I believe it is the 28th of the month for SESPs. And so I definitely invite you to attend that, because we're really going to spend a lot of time about developmental childhood trauma. So I don't want to get into it now. I'll just leave you with the teaser of that. So developmental trauma in adolescents, it impairs their language and communication skills. By language and communication skills, we may not necessarily be talking about articulation issues. We may be talking about social pragmatic skills. they lose the ability, because they never had used the ability to do reciprocal conversation. So they may not be able to respond when someone asks something. They don't know what the volleys are back and forth. Disorganized, difficulty organizing material. This is also not just hard material, but material that they need to store in their memory. So executive functioning plays a big role in kids with trauma. They have the inability to be able to organize what's happening as they go through the days. They have a tendency to remember tidbits of what they're supposed to do, may not necessarily be in the appropriate order, but because of things like lack of delayed gratification, as I've said before, they will not get the concept of, if I study every night, I will do well on this test, because there's no instant reward in studying every night for a test that's 2 weeks away, even though they may learn over the time that that is the best way to study. It may not necessarily be something that they can embrace or hold on to because they don't have, the delayed gratification skills. They have difficulty understanding cause and effect, and this plays out as well as an executive functioning. They don't realize that if they do something negative, that there may be negative consequences with that, and they don't learn from those negative consequences. So that definitely comes up in issues of disability and discipline, because if by doing something that is a negative consequence and they say, for example, lose recess, they don't think the next time, oh, I shouldn't do this because last time I lost recess. They don't have the ability to do that. And difficulty taking another's perspective. They don't have a good sense of self-perspective, so it's very hard for them to have a sense of somebody else's perspective. And that is definitely true, as we see that many times in the kids with trauma. It affects them in the inattentiveness in the classroom and classroom tasks. I'm not quite sure inattentiveness is always the case. It could be distractibility. If you're a child with trauma and you're worried about where your next meal comes from, you may not necessarily be thinking about the math problem, and it's not inattentiveness. You're distracted by worries and other thoughts. Trouble regulating their emotions is definitely true. There's a hypoarousal. Part of that is due to the stress hormones that I mentioned earlier, that you will find that they are going from, you think they're going from 0 to 60, when in fact they're going from 30 to 60, because they've got their stress hormones in their body that are keeping them aroused on a regular basis. And as I mentioned before, it definitely affects their executive functioning. And a lot of times developmental childhood trauma is commonly misdiagnosed as ADHD. And it's not until we get a thorough history for the child that we find out that there are adverse childhood experiences that have led to trauma. So I'm going to ask at this point if there are any questions.
So far, there aren't any questions. I'm not seeing any questions.
Okay. Any questions you have, Jean?
Do the schools have a hard time identifying this in school?
They definitely do, and a lot of times they're looking for outside providers to give diagnosis. I want everyone to remember that it is not, for a child to be on a social emotional IEP, it is not required that they have an actual emotional diagnosis for emotional disturbance. So that is not unusual for that to come up. But schools cannot, for the most part, diagnose unless they've got the staff to be able to do so. So I definitely recommend that if they can, they get an outside clinician to do a diagnosis. But you may see this coming up in the school's own testing where they may say we see characteristics of ADHD. I would then take that to a professional. For ADHD, it could be the care provider, their pediatrician, or an outside clinician to do that.
Okay, thank you. There are a few more questions. One from Paula Duggins. Can you please speak to the issue of interuteral drug dependency and resulting mental health issues as they grow?
So it depends on what type of drugs that they're using, but it's not uncommon many times for children, and it comes up a lot with the children we work with in foster care, to have also fetal alcohol syndrome, which is very similar, would lead to similar things as far as drug addiction. There's many kids who are born methadone addicted because methadone is the drug that's used to wean someone off of heroin. So these chemicals, while they're in utero, are definitely going to impact the ability of the child's neurons to be able to develop properly. So they come out with deficits from the very beginning, intellectual deficits for many times. Sometimes physical ailments as well. For fetal alcohol syndrome, you will see there are actually facial characteristics that you can tell during the development period. Again, it also depends on when the use was, how early in the pregnancy the use of substances were. Sometimes the mom may have not known that she was pregnant and was using prior to realizing that she was pregnant and then stopped, but it depends on where that is as to what impact it might have had on the child.
And this is from Isabel Dela Cruz. How would one know if it's developmental trauma versus ADHD?
You're really talking about a history here. There is no, again, diagnosing children is unfortunately a wanted skill. There are very few psychiatrists in the Boston area that specialize in children, diagnosing children. Trauma centers are probably the best place to go, or a trauma therapist to be able to do that. They have a tendency to be able to ask the right questions without necessarily going through and having to have the child relive the history. Because many children can't relive the history. They either don't have the cognitive skills to do that because of the time of the trauma, or they don't have the emotional maturity to be able to do that. But it is definitely something that through different conversations, through finding out backgrounds and histories, you can definitely find out whether there is an indication that there was some type of trauma.
Thank you, Mary Beth. That was very informative. I'd like to remind everyone that you will receive a follow-up survey, which we ask you to complete. Okay, so we aren't done yet. Are there any other questions?
Okay, I want to take a chance to be able to go over community-based services now that we've discussed some of the disorders. So the community-based services are available for children in the state of Massachusetts who have mental health issues. A diagnosis is required for this. And what that looks like it depends on the intake process for the community-based services. So this is through the CBHI, or Children's Behavioral Health Initiative, that has been around for about 7 or 8 years now, based on a lawsuit in Massachusetts called the Rosie D lawsuit, that children with Mass Health were not getting access to the same level of mental health care that children on private insurance have taken place. The irony of this is that it then became, the Children's Behavioral Health Initiative services then became the hallmark in Massachusetts to be getting services for your child. And we're going to go over what those are. And now, starting in July, They're looking at private insurances have been instructed to be able to offer these services. So we're looking forward to probably having someone come in and speak about that to us as to what's happening within the state with private insurance and the ability to get the same services that you can get if you're a Mass Health client. So this is the Children's Behavioral Health Initiative mission. It's to strengthen and expand and integrate Massachusetts state services into a comprehensive community-based system of care that will ensure families and children with significant behavioral, emotional, and mental health needs obtain the services necessary for success in home, school, and the community. So the great thing about this, it's called wraparound services, is that the family, the child and the family have all of their service providers wrapped around them. So it happens within the home, within the school, and within the community with their providers. So who is eligible? At this point, you still need to have Mass Health in order to be able to get these services. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have private insurance and also get Mass Health. You can do that in additional. You do have to be under the age of 21. On your 21st birthday, you're ineligible. You need to have a serious emotional impairment or behavioral health diagnosis and show medical necessity, in order to be able to receive the services. So you can get intensive care coordination, which is having a provider who will actually take over all scheduling of all those meetings that you try and have with your provider. Their job is really to get everyone on your team on the same page, all your providers, get them together and to help the parents and family work together in what's in the best needs of the child. So that can be in-home therapy. It can be, an in-home therapy can work with the school team as well as part of the service delivery grid if necessary. But they are clinicians that will come into the home and really see what's happening in your environment and help you with things that would be beneficial at home. There's in-home behavioral health, which is a little bit different. They work on specific behaviors that are happening in the home to try and alleviate them so that there's a decrease in in-home behaviors, particularly negative behaviors or self-harming behaviors. There's family support and training, which are provided by family partners. These are people with lived experience of having children with mental health issues, and they work with the parents to be able to help support them and what they're going through in this process. Therapeutic mentoring provides a mentor who is trained and works with an individual therapist to set up treatment goals. For example, if one of your child's problems is that their anxiety is so bad that they can't be around in social situations, that may be a goal that a therapeutic mentor can take the child out to the community and establish some skills with them to be able to handle that environment. And mobile crisis intervention is the ability to have a clinician come out to wherever you are, be it school, the mall, at home. If your child is having a crisis, mobile intervention is you make a phone call and they will send clinicians out to the house or wherever you are. We are looking actually at having someone come in and do a webinar on mobile crisis intervention in a further date, so we'll keep you updated on that. If you have questions about referrals or filling out a Mass Health application in order to receive these services, I suggest you give us a call. Pat would be happy to answer any questions. And like I said, we're looking forward to having Pat possibly come do a webinar about the changes that will be happening in private insurance as far as these services are concerned. But that's down a couple months away because right now they're still tweaking out what that means for private insurance and trying to establish best practices. So there's nothing formal available yet. So let's talk about impacting accessing the curriculum. As we spoke before, there are attention issues that makes it very hard to pay attention to the subject matter or if they've lost interest in the subject matter. So something that might have been a preferred activity is no longer a preferred activity. As we said before, it affects their thinking and their communication, working well with others if they have social pragmatic or social issues. The emotion regulation can definitely be a situation that affects them socially in school. If they are having meltdowns and other people, other students, peers are not comfortable with them. It can lead to oppositional behaviors, problems with authority figures. And it also can definitely be coexisting with specific learning disabilities. So don't rule out that someone who has a social emotional issue does not also have a learning disability, because they can definitely be coexisting. The IEP eligibility, it's best to have a diagnosis from a credentialed professional, and the earlier the better. Don't be afraid to take a child to a professional and find out what's going on. As I said before, it is not a requirement to have a diagnosis for a social emotional IEP. It does really clarify things if everyone knows what we're talking about, however. Get copies of incident reports. It'll give you a history to build on as far as what's happening in the classroom, or try and make an observation if you can of the classroom. Teacher observations. Talk to the teacher and find out what they're finding out, what the if there's a paraprofessional in the room, what's the other set of eyes seeing on a daily basis. What's happening with the student in their home environment is important. And if possible, if you can get a neuropsychological evaluation and can schedule that and pay for that, make sure that they offer concrete recommendations. It's not worth having one if they have recommendations that state something that Billy would benefit from. They need to be really concrete in saying the student needs to have this service. So these are some actions that you may see for a child who has emotional disability. And these can actually be manifestations as opposed to behaviors, manifestations of their disability in the classroom setting. So let's look at accommodations and interventions. I'm sure you've all heard of behavioral intervention plans. My comment of good versus evil is just a reflection on whether it actually works for a child or not. And for some children, they work fabulously, and other children, they don't. The purpose of the plan is to take behaviors that are negative behaviors and take a look at how to eliminate those negative behaviors and replace them with positive behaviors. Depending on the student, what their history is, that may work fabulously. It has a tendency to be used also with BCBAs for children with autism. Again, it also depends on what the diagnosis. If you're trying to do a behavioral intervention plan on a child who has oppositional defiance disorder, it's probably not going to work very effectively. So take a look at what the symptom is that's being acted upon. Does it actually modify the behavior, or is the list of expectations that adults have for them? Because many times that backfires, that they're not going to comply because they have problems with authority figures. And for children with developmental childhood trauma, they don't necessarily internalize cause and effect. So consequences or reward systems are not necessarily effective for them. Some options that you can take to look in the classroom about things that might be going on. You can ask for a functional behavioral assessment. They can be beneficial. It's usually the tool that's used to be able to develop the behavioral intervention plan. Work with your behavioralist about what it is that they're looking for so that it's focused. There is guidance from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education on social emotional learning objectives and curriculum. We give that out as a copy when we do our orientation. So if you've been through as a surrogate parent, you should have a copy of that. I believe you can also get that off of our website and our resources. So looking at some positive behavioral supports, think about what the physical setting is for a child. For example, if a child has some anxieties, maybe where they physically sit in the classroom is really important and key. Maybe if there's separation anxiety, sitting up front by the teacher would be important. And if they have other fears about worries about what's happening, part of their anxiety, then maybe sitting in the back of the classroom so they can see everything that's going on is the better thing. What are the task demands? What are we asking them to do? And do they have the skills in order to do that? The instructional pace, allowing students to be able to move at their own pace, and individualized reinforcements is beneficial. Some other services and what they might look like, there can be individual or group counseling that takes place in school with either the adjustment counselor or the school psychologist. Communication, having daily check-ins with the student of how they're going, social check-ins, not necessarily check-ins on how their binder is. Communication with the staff and the parents so that you're on the same board. Taking the student and working on social pragmatic skills so that they have the ability to be able to bond with their peers. Parent counseling and communication, making sure that what's happening in school might be the same language that's being used at home, so it's consistent, so that children are not able to split and do one thing at home and know that the teacher's never going to find out about it, or if something happens at school, the parent won't find out about it. Recreation. Participation in after-school activities a lot of times can be very beneficial for students with social and emotional disabilities. It allows them to feel like they're part of a group, and responsible, and building a community and being responsible to that community. It can definitely help them. And there's some rehabilitation services such as career development, employee preparation skills, and independent living skills for older students. So briefly, let's look at the least restrictive environments. The inclusion classroom obviously is the least restrictive, but it may be for certain of these students a therapeutic classroom or a therapeutic school is the least restrictive if they are in crisis. So give consideration to what is the best setting for the student given what state they're in at the time. Because again, this is not a decision for a therapeutic school is not a permanent lifetime decision. So I want to talk briefly about the Massachusetts tiered system of support. So tier 1 is the universal supports that will happen across the curriculum and with the entire student body. It should be collaborative, school and family problem solving, so that schools work with the parents and families about how the student is doing. Tier 2 being the supplemental and core tier, where you're getting more into working with smaller groups as opposed to the population as a whole to support students that need the extra support in a setting, and those may be group activities. That's where circle time can play in place, or restorative justice actions can take into place. And tier 3 is the intensive core, the really one-on-one that needs to happen for a particular student. Hopefully, if the school is good with the entire trauma focus, that can definitely help with emotional students by covering all the bases in tier 1. Actually going to, this is a slide that breaks down just 2 different systems of discipline in the school district. The zero tolerance education and how this can lead to the school to prison pipeline, or if they work with restorative justice, how it can lead to a very different outcome for the student by meeting the school counselor and help resolving the conflicts that are happening both at home and at school. So are there any questions?
Do we have time for one question? Or
Okay. Let's actually go to, I'm just going to wrap up and then we're going to go through a couple of them. So important to make sure that you have smart or strong measurable goals when you're writing goals for a social and emotional IEP. Measurable and obtainable is very important. What is the deficit you're looking at? How will it be worked on? Who's going to work on it? How will it be measured? I am going to actually move on to questions, since I know we have a bunch of them.
I'm going to ask one question, and then if we have time, and if we run out of time, we might just have them forwarded to you, and then you can answer
I
them.
would be happy to do
Okay,
that.
thank you for that. I have one question here. It says, this gal is working with an 8th grade student in private school setting who was hospitalized for 1 month at McLean for anxiety and depression in January. He requires a therapeutic educational setting. My question, does he need to return to public school for services and not succeed before qualifying for an out-of-district placement financed by his home district?
No, it is not a requirement that students fail out before trying to do correct the placement. Proving that the placement is the wrong setting for them, the current placement, is really the direction that you need to go with. And what are the students' needs at this point? It sounds a little bit more complicated, so it's something that you might want to give me a call here at the office and we can talk a little bit more about and give you some more specifics about it. But failing out is not a requirement in order to get an IEP.
One more question. Can you describe how a child with trauma or bipolar disorder may exhibit interview intolerance versus a child with ADHD?
Usually a child with ADHD will find things within the interview process to be interesting, particularly if you have a good interviewer, a good doctor who's doing the testing. What were the two disorders again?
Behavior disorder. Let's see, which one?
Trauma or bipolar.
Trauma or bipolar. Trauma kids have a tendency to be very standoffish, and they don't like necessarily be asked a lot of questions because of the just safety. They're shut down for the most part. For someone with bipolar, it's more of an authority figure situation. So for both of those, actually building a relationship with the child before the testing begins and a rapport makes a big difference on the ability to be able to do accurate testing.
Great. Well, thank you. Okay. Let's see. Can you please speak to the impact of diet and also screen time on a child's mental health?
I can definitely speak to diet. Screen time is still one that's definitely a constant study. I think one of the problems is that the scientists that are studying it also do a lot of screen time, and therefore it's a little hard to say don't do it if I do it all the time. Diet, there are different schools of thought around decreasing the amount of sugar that students intake, and also artificial coloring and preservative. So a more natural organic diet is better for kids. Particularly, there's questions about certain dyes that are used in food coloring, and whether they affect students. For example, with ADHD, red food dye was considered to be something that made the disorder worse. So for the most part, I think a healthy diet, a diet that is, and by healthy I mean that they're not necessarily having a sugary snack before bedtime, because that's going to affect their ability to be able to go to sleep. A frappuccino would not be a good call at 9 o'clock at night because of the caffeine issues. So diet in that sense would definitely be beneficial. As far as screen time goes, I can tell you, particularly around sleep hygiene, probably should have a period of time when they're off technology. The blue light is actually what's projected off of screen time, any of our screens, and blue light is used to trick the brain into daylight. So if you're trying to get a child to go to sleep at 9 o'clock at night and they're on their screen, it's telling their brain they should still be up and activated. So setting limits on screen time definitely are beneficial for kids. And then there's a whole nother discussion on what they're doing on screen time.
Right.
That's a whole nother training.
Right. One more question. How do you see the reactive attachment disorder manifest in school?
For the most part, reactive attachment disorder manifests in inappropriate attachments. It can very much be attached, they can be overly attached to staff at the school as opposed to their family. Behaviors at school, because they're peer-based, can also be affected. I have a child with a reactive attachment disorder, and peers relationships were absolutely huge for her. And having the right teacher who can set boundaries and rules and structures for them, which they say they hate, but that scaffolding is ever so important, of having rhythm and routine and knowing what was going on a regular basis. Having a teacher that can set expectations and keep those expectations are definitely important aspects to have when you're working with RAD children.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up now.
All right.
Thank you, Mary Beth. That was great. I'd like to remind everyone that you will be receiving a follow-up survey, which we ask you to complete. We value this information so that we can provide everyone with the most effective information to support the wonderful work that you do in supporting children. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and have a good day.